Sarah Pessin, and I hold an interfaith chair here at the university. And I wanted to use this opportunity to give us a quick sort of primer for faculty and administrators on how to get some quick, concrete change at DU when it comes to increasing religious inclusivity. So, really, the goal here is to take our religious inclusivity to the next level and to provide a kind of pretty straightforward action plan for faculty and administrators. So, let's start with faculty. Faculty should check an interfaith calendar, and we'll talk a little bit about more soon about how exactly to do that. But for the faculty, checking an interfaith calendar is really important so that you have a sense of some of the upcoming holidays that might impact your students and your class schedule. So when possible, try not to schedule major assignments due on a holiday that might impact your students. Don't schedule an exam on that date, or if you do, be aware in advance that some of your students might have conflicts, etc. So that's kind of one of the key pieces of having your eye on that as you're scheduling your major events in the class. But then also think about how to make your students feel welcome around the topic, well, around all topics of inclusivity, but for this purposes of this video, make them feel welcome around the topic of religious inclusivity. And here are some ways to do that. Add religious accommodations language to your syllabi, and I'll provide you with a link about where to find a template for that at DU. Proactively tell your students that you respect religious accommodations and that you invite them to talk with you, and then accommodate them. Obviously, if there's something that is very outside of what seems plausible for the class, I've been involved with these conversations over many years, and I haven't been privy to every single one of them. But I must say that in general, the students' requests are fairly straightforward and not that difficult to accommodate. Whether it's a makeup day for an exam or whether it's extra time for an exam, if, for example, they're fasting that day, or whether they will just be missing class on a given day and don't penalize them if they're having a religious reason for doing so. So there are more resources that I'll get to in a moment where students can, where there could be more scaffolding as needed. But I think in many, many cases, really just letting your students know that you are open to their religious accommodation requests just makes them feel comfortable speaking with you. And again, if some situation becomes more complicated, there are more resources available. But truly, I think that this is just something that most faculty, if they sort of just implement these few small points on their syllabi and just mentioning it in the beginning of the class out loud that they're open to their students' needs in this respect, it really creates a very deeply different cultural environment or a sense of inclusivity, experience of inclusivity, and a sense of feeling welcomed on behalf of many, many students. So it's a pretty straightforward piece to do. Students can also access the accommodations request form on the Spiritual Life page at DU's Cultural Center, where Chendu is our director and a wonderful resource as well. And students can find there many details, but also and can reach out to Chendu and find other resources, but also can find details, for example, written details on how to proceed if a professor denies an accommodation request. So there is a link. And then also, if you would like to up your game in the classroom, I would encourage you to visit the Office of Teaching and Learning Inclusive Teaching portal, where there are opportunities to learn about multiple intersectional dimensions of inclusivity, including an entire module with resources for spiritual and religious diversity. This is, again, an amazing set of resources. This is curated by our Office of Teaching and Learning's Associate Director for Inclusive Teaching Practices, Dr. Valentina Iturbe-Lagrave. And so I would encourage you to go there. Here's a couple of things you can find on that page. The religious accommodation statement is there that you can just copy and paste for your syllabi. There is actually also a link on that page for students who want to access the religious accommodations request form. Valentina has curated their definitions, recommended articles, a set of what's called Tannenbaum fact sheets, which are not for every holiday by any stretch, but this is a wonderful resource that Just you can have the links to different fact sheets around a handful of holidays, which might be of use for yourself and for your students and others. There's information there about supporting media, TED Talks, different websites, etc. So it's a wonderful resource that I encourage you to check out. So that's sort of some of the key pieces for how faculty can increase religious inclusivity in their classrooms. And then there's the secret ingredient that is actually going to work for faculty and for administrators. And this secret ingredient is interfaith your calendar. One of the things that I'm always struck by when people talk about sort of, religious inclusivity, and when I say let's take DO's religious inclusivity to the next level, usually that sounds like a very big goal, and in a way, of course, it is a big goal, but the really nice thing about it is that one of that secret ingredient in particular is a really, really tiny thing that's not really too much fanfare needed to make it work really, really well. It's the tiny piece about interfaithing your calendar. Basically, you need to check an interfaith calendar if you want to have better religious inclusivity outcomes, whether it's in your classes or in your offices and for the overall DU environment. Of course, checking the interfaith calendar means having an interfaith calendar. But it doesn't just mean having an interfaith calendar. It means having an easy, realistic, and practical, accessible calendar, which in part also then means that you would be able to consult it realistically and practically and regularly and at the right times. And so one of the things that I emphasize here is that it needs to be your regular, everyday, boring online calendar. I know some of us might have an interfaith calendar that we hang up in our living room or in our den or in our kitchen where there's sort of pictures of children from different backgrounds dancing in a circle. That's very nice, but it's actually not the kind of practical calendar that you're going to have on hand or not actually on hand, but on your computer as you're actually scheduling things. So as much as I love a good wall calendar with glossy photos of children from different backgrounds dancing, that's actually more of a side point to the interfaithing your calendar. It's about interfaithing your actual boring online work calendar. And I like to sort of talk about my pen principle where interfaith calendar checking should be as routine, and I would add boring, as purchasing pens. You have a system for one, you need a system for the other. Again, it's not really about sort of some big gestures. I mean, it could be that as well, but we need to start with what's simple and routine. And so what's simple and routine, back to that secret ingredient, is interfaithing your calendar. How do you interfaith your calendar? So there's this huge URL here, which if you're watching this as a video, you wouldn't be able to link. So I think the easiest way is if you go into Google and just type in University of Denver Center for Judaic Studies Interfaith Challenge, you should find your way to the page that I'm about to show you. And if that is not the case, then I am pausing here enough on this slide so that hopefully you can take a screenshot of the URL and then type it in there. But I think just that Google search will yield the page in question that will get you to interfaith your calendar. So basically when you get to that page, you'll find 3 handy dandy guides for different versions of Outlook and for Google Calendar. And basically you will click the read more button and it will download a PDF, which is essentially like a step-by-step guide. And it'll take you about 12-ish minutes to turn and transform. I left out a word there. Okay, 12-ish easy minutes to transform, I meant to say, your everyday online work calendar. I don't know what it says there. 12-ish easy minutes to your everyday online work calendar being interfaith. Oh, I didn't leave out any words, it turns out. Okay, so it'll take you about 12 minutes is what I'm trying to say. So by clicking on that read more, it will actually download a PDF, and the PDF will look something like this, depending on which one you download. And when you go through the PDF, it is literally screenshots step by step for how you do it. Of course, the screenshots will be a little bit different on your computer, depending on your computer and your operating system and which, etc. But we have found that many people have been able to use these step-by-step guides, and in about 12 minutes, their everyday online work calendar is interfaithed. Okay, on that page that you'll find that on, and this is sort of again, work through it, and you'll get hopefully success on at least parts of it, and you'll see what I mean by that. There's some internal calendars you'll be able to turn on, and some external calendars. The external calendars, not everyone has success with, but you will find success in at least some additional interfaithing of your calendar from what it is now. And you'll also on that page find some best practices for interfaith scheduling. And you can download those, and then they're also assembled on the page. So I won't go through all of them, but I'll go through a couple of them quickly. So you now have your calendar has now been interfaithed, which essentially means you have an easy to use interfaith calendar. So now what? Of course, simply having an interfaith calendar in your everyday calendar is only the first step. If you don't do anything with it, then that's not going to help anything. So first, one very important best practice. What are concrete ideas for how to be sure that someone in your office consults the interfaith calendar before scheduling events? I don't mean to be pedantic, but I really want to emphasize that, and I won't read this verbatim, but these are some of the sort of from that sort of best practices. It's really important that you develop a strategy for who in your office checks the interfaith calendar before scheduling events. It just needs to be programmed in there, and I sort of don't rely on your good intentions to make this happen, because you of course have good intentions, but how many times has your office messed this up? A lot. So it's not about good intentions. It's about sort of boring routine ways, back to that pest and pen principle. Just get it in there, figure it out. So please schedule a meeting with the relevant members of your team to brainstorm and finalize a step-by-step concrete plan for who in your office consults the interfaith calendar, and how you kind of hold accountable to that when planning events and meetings. For example, if your office has event checklists, then commit to having, to either yourself or the person whose job that would be, who oversees that, those checklists, to please commit to adding that, sort of check the interfaith calendar to those checklists. So let me pause there. I'm really urging, if this is important to you and your office, or to you and to your division, to your department, whatever your sphere of influence is, please really schedule with the relevant person or persons that discussion, and then operationalize it. One example, put it into that checking the checklist, however you want to operationalize it, but please just make it something that you can't forget, because just relying on your memory is not going to work, and in good intentions alone are not going to save this. This goes back to, this is a tiny thing to do, but you have to actually do it, and then you'll have the calendar, and you'll have someone checking the calendar in advance of scheduling events. Again, a bit pedantic, but I really want to pause and emphasize that, because like all habits, you have to make some kind of a concrete change in order for the habit to take hold. And that's why I am emphasizing it. So I'm going to run through a couple of others. So keep in mind that it's not always a bad thing to schedule an event or a meeting on a religious holiday. Some reasons where it might be okay, like for example, if you have a reading group, let's say in your office, and no one celebrates the religious holiday in question, then that's certainly fine. Then just go ahead and don't even think about it. This isn't sort of somehow signaling. This is like a real thing. If no one in your reading group celebrates holiday ABC, then that's not an issue. However, keep in mind that in smaller groups, even in smaller groups, I should say, don't assume that you know everybody's practices around different religious, spiritual activities. So provide multiple opportunities for people in your groups to share their religious accommodation needs. And if you are planning departmental or university-wide events, I definitely don't assume that you have any sense of how many people would be impacted by a certain religion. So just sort of practical and concrete. If you're in a small group and you know that nobody's celebrating a certain holiday, then it's a non-issue. If you are in a small group, still be mindful and give people a chance to express their religious accommodation needs. Don't tokenize people, for example, while you're doing that. So don't say, hey, I think you're Jewish, so what do you need? Maybe somebody is or isn't a certain religion, and maybe they don't want to identify to the group that way. So don't make assumptions about who's in your group. Don't make assumptions about whether they want you to announce their religion, or your assumptions about what their religious or spiritual practices, expressivities are. Just give opportunities. Things like, hey, does anyone have any religious accommodation requests as we plan the book reading schedule for our group? That's an example of what you might say, and if somebody wants to, then they can identify that. And again, if it's a larger group, like you're scheduling for the whole DU or for a whole unit or department, definitely take more care. Also, keep in mind that not all religious holidays prevent someone from that religion from attending an event. So, you need strategies. Once you see that there's a religious holiday on the calendar, you need some strategy for finding out a little bit more about that holiday. And, assuming somebody is affected by it, it might not actually keep them from attending an event. So it's not that, oh my goodness, there's a holiday, and yes, I know that somebody celebrates that holiday, so therefore I can't schedule something. That's actually not true. So you do need to come up with systems, for example, Wikipedia, or talking with colleagues, to learn a bit more about the holidays. So you need to learn, give people an opportunity in your group or groups to sort of identify their religious accommodation needs, and then also either talk with them or consult online or talk with other colleagues about the kinds of events that might be inconsistent with certain holidays, etc., etc. There's so many different details. Certain holidays have observance requirements for certain people. Other holidays don't. Even for holidays that have observance for some, even if someone's not quote unquote observant or worshiping, they still might need an accommodation because of the cultural dimensions, etc. So just find opportunities, use it as an opportunity to learn more about the holiday, either from colleagues or online. From what I just said, another best practice: do not focus on whether people are observant or whether they are worshiping. It is really none of our business whether our religious or spiritual colleagues are sort of worshiping the divine. That is actually not our business. There are plenty of holidays that are more popular in the life cycle of American culture, where people go home to spend time with their families. I have no idea whether they're worshiping God, and that's not actually the main consideration. It's wonderful if somebody's worshiping God. It's also wonderful if they're not worshiping God, but there are cultural and life cycle implications of different holidays and festivals. So please avoid sort of, oh, well, this person isn't observant, so therefore they don't need off for a holiday. That's really not a good way to think about the inclusivity around religious and spiritual inclusivity. Another best practice: be thoughtful about the days before and after holidays and festivals. Again, I know, there's a lot of time constraints and we can't accommodate everything, but in terms of, first steps in thinking about this stuff, keep in mind that if somebody's traveling home for the holiday or for a religious festival, they might need the day for travel, etc. So just, or they might be preparing a large meal for visitors who are coming to their home, etc., etc. So again, it's an opportunity to learn more about your neighbors, and including your neighbors at DU, on the DU campus, your students, your colleagues, and your colleagues, students, our staff, administrators, everybody at DU. It's a chance to sort of learn more about what might be the best way to be accommodating and inclusive. And I will add, take special care on fasting days. If you're an administrator or somebody who's planning an event, that would not be a great day to have a sort of, a major banquet on campus. Similarly, if you're a faculty, expect that students who celebrate that, whether it's a holiday or whether it's an observance, or whether it's related to fasting in particular, they might need extra time on an assignment or an exam, or they might, if it's possible, need to reschedule an exam. The physical toll of fasting obviously has implications. So these are all ways of sort of thinking together about what it means to really, sort of think deeper about what it means for people to feel welcome. Here I would also add that in religious inclusivity does not mean observing other people's religions. I mean, you can certainly take an interest in religions, and if you personally want to observe multiple religions, that's up to you. But what I mean to say is, we're on a campus where we value religious inclusivity, and we also value American pluralism. So, for example, there are, I think, two pitfalls as a community that we need to avoid: too little inclusivity and too little pluralism. So, too little inclusivity in the case of religious inclusivity might be, some thought or comment like, oh, some religions don't eat pork, but I'm not going to go out of my way to provide a non-pork option, right? So that would be too little inclusivity. On the other hand, too little pluralism would be to say, oh my goodness, some religions don't eat pork, so we need to, eradicate all pork from campus. No, neither of those two are helpful for what we're, I think, for a thoughtful, engaged community. And so I just like to highlight that, just to, I don't know, give some further food for thought. And lastly, and this is on that best practices sheet as well, I like to always sort of emphasize that if your office or classroom schedules an event on a religious holiday, which again, try not to, right? Make an effort, have that interfaith calendar in your everyday calendar, have conversations with people to see, if people need accommodation, et cetera, et cetera. If there's a situation where you cannot avoid the conflict, I think it is really important for an inclusive, welcoming environment. I think it matters to acknowledge and apologize. And this is an interesting, some people might disagree with me on this. So if at the very least, I hope it opens the conversation. But I really do think acknowledge and apologize. And I've heard from many, many people on campus and off campus with whom I've shared these sorts of discussions who would agree that acknowledging and apologizing is actually better than ignoring it or hoping nobody notices. It creates an environment where people feel that that at least the campus is aware that there's a conflict or your office is aware. So here's some language that, it's a template to you if you'd like to use. Again, it's on that fact sheet or on that best practices sheet that you can download from that Center for Judaic Studies interfaith page. But, here's, we apologize to those who might be unable to attend our event due to this holiday. Scheduling and other factors led us to select this date, and we hope to avoid similar outcomes in the future. Inclusivity, including religious inclusivity, is a value we work hard to uphold. If your office genuinely, does not have the trust of people, then maybe people would hear this kind of a statement as sort of an opportunity for an eye roll where it's like, oh wow, this is disingenuous. But hopefully your office has trust, it has the trust of people, or is earning more of the trust of people, and comes to the point where a statement like this would actually be felt in a genuine way. I think that part of how we get there is by issuing these kinds of statements so that people know that we're understanding and we're working. Not that we're understanding, but that we're trying. To try and to acknowledge and apologize, I think, is a quite different environment than to just sort of ignore it entirely. So I think it's obviously best if we can avoid holiday conflicts, and when we can't, I would urge us to acknowledge and apologize. And that's the end of the presentation. If you have any edits or ideas or thoughts for, things to include or things to edit, as, this is always a 2.0 in progress conversation, I hope you would contact me. And thank you again for taking the time to consider some of these thoughts as we work together to make our campus a more inclusive and welcoming space.